The diner looked ordinary until I noticed the employee didn't cast a shadow. At first I thought it was a trick of the dim lighting, but the longer I stared, the more I realized something was wrong. Their eerie smiles felt too forced, their movements too fluid, like they weren't entirely human. Then they leaned in close, their voice dropping to a whisper, and began telling me secrets about the diner's dark past, secrets no living person could possibly know. What I learned that night wasn't just horrifying, it shattered everything I thought I understood about life and death. The neon sign buzzed erratically, casting a sickly green glow onto the cracked asphalt as I pulled into the empty parking lot. The diner squatted at the edge of the road, a relic from another era, its peeling paint and clouded windows exuding a forlorn loneliness. I hesitated before stepping out, the distant hum of insects swallowed by an unnatural stillness. The road behind stretched endlessly, no headlights or signs of life in sight. Pushing open the heavy glass door, a small bell jingled overhead, its chime oddly muted. Inside, the diner smelled faintly of old grease and something metallic. A jukebox in the corner sputtered out an ancient tune, the sound warped as though played underwater. I glanced around. The booths were empty, the countertops gleaming as though freshly cleaned. Welcome, came a voice, smooth and cheerful. I turned and froze. The employee stood behind the counter. Their unnervingly wide smile stretched just a little too far. Their bright eyes didn't blink, and for a moment, I thought they were a mannequin. But then they moved too fluidly, as though gliding rather than stepping. "What can I get you?" they asked, their voice echoing faintly, like a whisper caught in a cavern. My eyes darted around, looking for something, anything to anchor my unease. Then I saw it. The fluorescent lights above cast shadows from every object in the room, chairs, stools even. My own reflection in the glossy floor. Everything, except for the employee. The realization hit like ice water. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back a step. "Are you okay?" the employee asked, their head tilting just a little too far. The smile never faltered. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, just tired." But I couldn't take my eyes off the space where their shadow should have been. Exhaustion played tricks on the mind, didn't it? I slid into a booth, its red vinyl seat sticky from the humid air. The employee appeared almost instantly, a coffee pot in hand, steam curling like ghostly tendrils from the spout. "Black coffee, right? You've always liked it that way." I froze mid-reach, my hand hovering over the cup. How? How did you know that?" The employee's smile widened, but they didn't answer. They simply turned and glided back to the counter, leaving me to wrestle with the creeping unease pooling in my chest. I glanced around the diner again. It felt too still. The jukebox continued its distorted melody, and the fluorescent lights flickered sporadically. There was no sound of a kitchen, no clatter of dishes or hiss of a grill, just silence, thick and oppressive. Sipping the coffee, my gaze drifted back to the counter. The employee was still there, unmoving, their head slightly tilted as though listening to something only they could hear. Then it happened again. My hand trembled as I noticed my own shadow stretching across the booth, perfectly aligned with the flickering lights above, but the employee's figure remained unnaturally flat against the wall, the light passing through them as though they weren't solid. My heart began to race. "Are you feeling okay?" the employee asked, their voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I'm fine," I muttered, standing abruptly. I needed to leave. Now. But when I turned toward the door, it seemed farther away than before, the distance yawning, like a dark tunnel. And just for a moment, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow, where one shouldn't be, stretching toward me. I stared into my coffee, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill crawling up my spine. "Long night?" the employee asked, leaning closer, their grin softening but their eyes unnervingly intense. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "You know," the employee began, their tone suddenly lowered, more serious. "This place has a history. Not the kind you talk about over breakfast." I stiffened. "What kind of history?" The employee tilted their head, a quiet crack echoing from their neck. "People stop here late at night, like you. They don't leave. But the diner keeps running, always waiting for the next visitor." A shiver ran through me. "Were you here for all that?" The employee paused mid-motion, their grin fading. "I was here for everything." Before I could respond, a faint scratching sound like nails on wood echoed from the back of the diner. Turning, I saw it, a locked door, trembling slightly under unseen pressure. "What's behind that door?" I whispered. The employee's face darkened, their stillness suddenly oppressive. "That's where the truth is," they murmured. But you don't want to know. The scratching grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate. I couldn't look away, the door seeming to pulse with life. What's back there? I demanded, my voice unsteady. The employee's grin returned, wider this time. Curiosity isn't safe here. The lights flickered, and I swore I saw movement behind the door, a shadow shifting. Unnaturally. The scraping stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, suffocating. Who locked it? I asked. It locks itself, the employee said, their grin splitting unnaturally wide. A faint knock came from the other side, slow and deliberate. The knock echoed through the diner as I stumbled away, the air thick and stifling. The door to the parking lot seemed farther than before, the warm glow beyond replaced by endless blackness pressing against the glass. The jukebox sputtered, its song warping into discordant noise. Shadows on the walls twisted, stretching unnaturally, crawling closer like living things. My pulse raced as the employee's voice cut through the chaos. There's nowhere to go. The shadows surged forward, their movements predatory. I turned, but the employee's face had twisted, their grin splitting impossibly wide. The shadows weren't just moving, they were reaching for me. I bolted for the door, but froze. The diner wasn't empty anymore. Figures sat in the booths, heads bowed and hands unnaturally still. Their pale, waxy skin gleamed under the flickering lights. You shouldn't have stopped here, one whispered, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. My breath hitched. None of them cast shadows. They tried to leave too, the employee said, appearing beside me, but not everything belongs. Outside, the figures jerked, their limbs moving like broken puppets. One reached out, whispering, stay. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. The employee's grin widened as I backed away. You've been here before, they said. There. Voice deepening. No, I stammered, though the unease in my gut argued otherwise. Oh, but you have, the employee hissed, stepping closer, their teeth glinting unnaturally sharp. Images flooded my mind, a younger version of myself watching shadows drag screaming people into the locked door. No, I gasped. That's not possible. Isn't it? The employee whispered, their glowing eyes narrowing as the door rattled ominously. I stood frozen as the vision played out in vivid, horrifying detail. The locked door had been open once, spilling red light while shadowy figures dragged victims. Inside, a young me sat, terrified, clutching a stuffed animal as the screams echoed. You left something behind, the employee whispered. What did I leave? I choked, shaking. Yourself, the employee said, as the door began to crack open once more, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. I bolted for the exit, but the parking lot was gone, replaced by endless darkness. You can't leave, the employee said, their grin growing monstrous. The walls stretched, the lights flickered, and shadows crept closer, their tendrils slithering toward me. No matter where I ran, I ended up back at the counter, the diner looping endlessly. The shadows wrapped around my legs, pulling me toward the open door, where the red light pulsed like a predator waiting to devour. The shadows dragged me to the door as I screamed and clawed at the floor. It's time, the employee whispered. You've always belonged to it. The room beyond was an endless void of writhing shadows, glowing eyes staring hungrily. No, I sobbed as the darkness swallowed me whole. The diner fell silent. Next, the employee said, waiting for their next victim. The red light consumed me as shadows dragged me into an endless void. Shapes writhed in the darkness, merging and splitting, their whispers a chorus of anguish and hunger. At the center, a massive, pulsing darkness stares back, its surface crawling with blinking eyes. Welcome home, the employee said, stepping from the shadows. What is this? I gasped. The diner's heart, they replied. It feeds on souls like yours. You'll join it or take my place. The shadows surged, icy tendrils brushing my skin, faces forming within them, screaming silently for release. Choose, the employee commanded, their voice echoing with power. I thrashed against the shadows, grabbing a rusted chair and striking wildly. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as I bolted toward the door. The void shifted around me, shadows growing larger, their whispers turning into a single command, stay. A tendril snared my ankle, dragging me back. You can't escape, the employee roared, their voice booming. I swung the chair again, connecting with something solid. The shadows shrieked, scattering just long enough for me to lunge forward and dive through the door into blinding light. I landed in a gray void, the air silent and suffocating. You can't leave without payment, a voice hissed, everywhere and nowhere. What do you want? I whispered. Your soul, the shadows replied. No, I cried. Take part of it. Just let me go. The shadows stilled, A piece for freedom, they agreed. They surged forward, pain tearing through my chest as if ripping something vital away. You'll leave the shadows, whispered, but never escape. I woke up on cold pavement. The diner was gone, replaced by an empty lot. Shaking, I stumbled into my car and sped away. Relief came briefly until I looked in the rear-view mirror. My reflection stared back, solid and familiar, but something was missing. I cast no shadow. The shadow's final words echoed in my mind, you'll never truly escape. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath shaky, my chest tight. The empty lot where the diner once stood faded in the rearview mirror as I sped away. Relief bubbled up in my chest, but it was fragile, clinging to the hope that the nightmare was over. Then, as the morning sun broke over the horizon, I noticed it. My hands, illuminated by the golden light, seemed strange, flat. My breath hitched as I glanced at the dashboard and the seat beside me. Both were awash in soft shadows, but my hands cast none. A cold wave of dread swept through me. Frantically, I pulled the car over, scrambling to check my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but behind me, the seat was empty of any shadow. No, I whispered, shaking my head violently. I clawed at my chest as if I could tear the mark away, but it was no use. The diner had taken something, a piece of my soul. The whispers began softly, creeping into my ears like tendrils. You'll come back, they said, in a voice eerily familiar, chillingly cheerful. It's only a matter of time. The steering wheel felt heavier in my hands as the hum of a distant jukebox rose from nowhere, its broken melody crawling into my mind. The world around me seemed dimmer now, the sunlight less warm. Behind my reflection in the mirror, a shape flickered just for a moment. A grin, far too wide. And then I knew. The diner wasn't gone. It had moved, waiting for its next visitor, waiting for its next soul. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings the diner closer. And ask yourself, are you sure you're alone? Or is something waiting, just out of sight, to claim your shadow too? Every night, I followed the same routine, patrolling empty rides and silent tents. But lately, something's been changing. The carnival seems to be waking up, and with it, the terrifying rules that keep me trapped. If I don't obey, I fear I won't make it through the next night. I was desperate for a steady paycheck. After losing my job as a security guard due to my constant distractions, I needed something stable, something that wouldn't remind me of my failures. That's when I found the position at the abandoned carnival, a job as a night watchman. I used to keep an eye on the place while it sat there, collecting dust. The pay was decent, and frankly, it was better than nothing. But I wasn't prepared for what I'd find. It was my first night on the job, and already I regretted it. The air was thick with decay, the Ferris wheel looking like a giant skeleton against the starless sky, its metal frame creaking in the wind. The carnival grounds felt dead, abandoned years ago, untouched, forgotten. Yet as I walked through the empty space, there was something unsettling about it, a feeling gnawing at me that I couldn't shake. The tents flapped in the wind, but the whole place was eerily quiet, save for an old, distant melody, a carousel tune, distorted and broken. I froze. The carousel was still. Its horses were frozen in place, their painted eyes staring off into the void. There was no power running through the carnival. No one else was supposed to be here. So where was the music coming from? I told myself it was just a glitch, a mechanical malfunction, or the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't deny it. I was not alone. The cold air bit into my skin, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was moving in the shadows, and I couldn't quite make out what it was. Every night, I followed the same routine, patrolling empty rides and silent tents. But tonight felt different. The carnival seemed to be waking up, and with it, the terrifying rules that would keep me trapped. As the night dragged on, unease crept in like a slow tide. The silence had always been overwhelming, but tonight it was suffocating. Every corner I turned felt like it was hiding. Something, every shadow seemed to twitch, move in ways it shouldn't. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt watched. Every whisper of the wind sounded like a distant voice calling my name. The carnival had been shut down for years, abandoned by both visitors and workers. Yet, tonight, it didn't feel abandoned at all. I was walking past the bumper car area when I noticed something strange, a small, dusty toy lying in the middle of the road. A toy car, its wheels cracked and faded. I hadn't seen it when I passed by earlier. I bent down to pick it up, but just as my fingers brushed against it, a voice whispered from the darkness, "Don't." I jumped back, my heart leaping into my throat. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. The wind had died. The carnival, once again, was still. No one else was there. I shook my head, convincing myself it was a trick of the mind, some stray gust of wind that carried a sound. But that voice, it lingered in my ears, its warning urgent, almost pleading. That was when I saw him. Frank. He was standing just outside the ring of lights around the carousel, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with fear, darting nervously between the flickering lights as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. He wasn't supposed to be here, he had been fired. Years ago, long before I took the job. And yet, there he was, standing in front of me, looking more like a ghost than a man. "You're the new guy, right?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Listen carefully. There are rules here, and if you don't follow them, the carnival will make sure you never leave." I stared at him, confusion mixing with unease. "Rules." Frank glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if someone or something was watching. His voice dropped to a whisper. "The carnival, it has a mind of its own. Follow the rules and you might make it through the night. Break them, and it'll find a way to keep you." I wanted to laugh it off. It sounded insane. But Frank's eyes were wide with terror, and something in his voice made me hesitate. "What kind of rules?" I asked, swallowing hard. Frank's face seemed to lose focus for a moment, as if lost in a memory, then snapped back to me. His voice was barely audible, a breath against the wind. "You'll see soon enough. Just don't stay past midnight. And for God's sake, never look behind you." Before I could ask more, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps swallowed by the carnival's silence. My heart hammered in my chest. Was he serious? Was this some kind of joke? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The second night wasn't supposed to be any different. I should have known better. Frank's words were still fresh in my mind, like a chill that settled deep in my bones. But I convinced myself to ignore it, to just get through the shift, like any other night. After all, I needed this job, needed the money. But nothing felt normal anymore. As soon as I entered the carnival grounds, I felt the same oppressive weight hanging in the air. It was heavier now, thicker. Every creak of metal, every flap of a tent felt like something watching me, waiting. I decided to start my rounds at the back, by the old funhouse. It was one of the oldest attractions, still standing, its bright colors faded and peeling. The entrance looked like a mouth, dark and open, waiting to swallow me whole. I couldn't explain why, but something pulled me inside. The smell hit me first, a musty, stale scent of old popcorn and mold. I flicked my flashlight on, the beam trembling slightly in my hand as it illuminated the cobweb-covered walls. The mirrors inside weren't just reflections, they were distortions. The figures staring back at me weren't my own. They were twisted, their faces blurred and shapeless, their eyes too wide. I turned around, heart racing, but the room was empty. My breath was shallow, my pulse quickening. I felt a presence, though. I couldn't explain it. It was as if something was standing just behind me. I dared not look. My body refused to move. My legs locked in place. And then, a low whisper, soft but clear, sent a chill through my spine. "Don't look behind you." I froze. I couldn't move. The words repeated in my head, louder now, echoing in the hollow emptiness. "Don't look behind you." The walls felt like they were closing in, the mirrors reflecting. Nothing but darkness. Something was there, just beyond the glass, watching me. I had no choice. I had to turn. I had to see. But I didn't. The rule. Frank's warning. The one thing I had to obey. I didn't turn around. And that was when the lights went out. The third night hit me like a freight train. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but this wasn't it. The carnival had changed overnight. Or maybe it had always been like this, and I was only now seeing it for what it truly was. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers were louder, and the carnival wasn't just a collection full of decaying rides anymore. It was a living thing, breathing in the dark. I could feel it in my bones, the sense that something was always just behind me, always following, always watching. I found myself walking past the old haunted house, the one attraction that no one had dared to visit for years. The door creaked open, almost inviting me in. I don't know why I stepped inside. Maybe it was the strange pull of the place, the unsettling quiet that seemed to scream for attention. But I had to go in. I had to know what was waiting for me. Inside, the house smelled like dust and neglect. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The walls were covered in old circus posters, their colors faded and torn. There was something off about them. They looked wrong. The faces in the photos seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I had to blink twice to convince myself I wasn't seeing things. And then I heard footsteps behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. The sound of footsteps, though, continued, growing louder, closer. I started to panic, my heart thumping in my chest. The walls seemed to close in. My body screamed for me to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in mud. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But the door, the exit, was gone. The house was alive. It wasn't going to let me go. I could hear a voice now, soft and sinister, coming from the shadows. You shouldn't have come inside. I tried to back out, but the walls pushed me in. The floor creaked. Something was waiting. By the time midnight hit, the carnival had swallowed me whole. There was no escaping it. Could feel its presence everywhere, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. The air was thick with the smell of old popcorn and stale cotton candy. But now there was something else, something darker, more primal, as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive. I had to make it to the Ferris wheel. That was the only way out. Frank had warned me about it, about how the carnival would claim me if I didn't stop it. I didn't know what was waiting for me there, but I had no choice. I had to stop it. As I neared the Ferris wheel, the lights flickered to life, brighter than before, spinning faster, as if feeding on my fear. The carnival was awake, and it was hungry. The giant wheel creaked in the silence, the cars swaying in the wind. I reached the base of it, my heart thudding in my chest. And then I saw it, the figure, the creator of the carnival. His face was a mask of twisted metal and rust, his eyes glowing like embers in the night. Welcome to my carnival, he rasped, his voice like the sound of metal scraping against stone. You're not leaving. Not now. Not ever. I stumbled back, terror clawing at my throat, but the wheel continued to spin, faster now. I had to do something. I had to end it. I made my way to the control panel, my hands shaking as I tried to find the right switch, the right lever. But before I could, I felt the grip of something cold around my wrist. I looked up, but it was too late. The carnival had claimed me. The first rays of dawn barely touched the carnival, but the air still felt thick with the weight of something ancient. The Ferris wheel, which had once creaked and groaned in the darkness, was still now frozen in place. The carnival, at least on the surface, seemed to have died along with the night. But I knew better. I could feel it. I thought I had escaped, convinced myself that I had broken free from the nightmare, that I had somehow outsmarted the twisted forces that haunted this forsaken place. But as I stood there, in the shadow of the Ferris wheel, I realized something far worse than the terror I'd endured. I hadn't escaped at all. The whispers returned, soft at first, just a murmur in the wind. But as I turned to leave, they grew louder, clearer, until they were right behind me. Don't turn around. The voices hissed. And, despite every warning that screamed at me to resist, my body betrayed me. I turned. There, standing in the distance, was the carnival worker from the first night, the one whose eyes had followed me, whose shadow I had felt creeping just behind me. But now, he wasn't. Standing alone. The figures, hundreds of them, were emerging from the darkness. The faces, twisted in expressions of unearthly horror, their hollow eyes staring directly at me. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body trembling as the carnival workers closed in. The carnival had never let me go. It had only been biding its time, waiting for me to think I had won. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figures drew closer, their footsteps syncing with the eerie, familiar tune of the carousel that I now realized was never truly gone. And then, I felt the pull, something invisible yet unmistakable, wrapping around my chest, dragging me back toward the carnival. It was calling me. The carnival wasn't finished with me. It was only just beginning. I tried to run, but the ground beneath my feet became soft, as if the earth itself was swallowing me whole. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, and I knew with chilling certainty that the carnival would keep me here forever. But as the last piece of light disappeared from the sky, I heard it again, the faint sound of the poor carousel, drifting just out of reach. I wasn't alone anymore. The carnival would never let me leave. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows? I thought it was just an old building with a weird history. But when the patient files started updating by themselves, I realized something darker was at play. The descriptions in the files aren't just wrong, they're impossible. As the night drags on, I realize the names, symptoms, and details are becoming disturbingly familiar, like they're describing me. It was one of those nights where the silence felt heavy, like the kind of quiet that makes you question if the world outside still exists. I had worked the night shift at the small rural medical clinic for the past 6 months, and I had gotten used to the isolation. The clinic, an old, creaky building at the edge of town, seemed to stretch on endlessly. The floors were worn, the paint chipped, and the flickering fluorescent lights gave the place an eerie atmosphere. But it was manageable. It was only me on this shift, a receptionist in a place where few patients came at night. The clock above the desk showed 2:45 a.m. The clinic had been still for hours. The hum of the old machines in the back was a constant background noise. Normally, I would just pass the time, reading, or sometimes scrolling through my phone. Tonight, though, I felt restless. I checked the clinic's email system to find a new patient update. Nothing out of the ordinary at first, just routine. But then I saw it. A patient file that had updated on its own without any input from me or anyone else. I stared at the screen for a moment, confused. The name, age, and basic details were accurate, but the symptoms listed were unexplained presence, feeling watched. I blinked. This wasn't right. I hadn't seen any patients that fit that description, and no one had come in for hours. I clicked through to investigate further, but the file updated again, and this time, it was even stranger. It described a patient in vivid detail. Subject reports feeling of being observed, despite being alone. Unable to shake the sensation of an unseen presence, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, watching me. The clinic had always been quiet, but tonight, it felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. As I turned back to the screen, the lights above me flickered once, then again. I froze. Then, a faint sound echoed down the hall, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but when I checked the security cameras, the hallways were empty. There was no one there. My stomach churned. The silence was back, but it felt different now, charged with something I couldn't explain. I shook my head, dismissing it as a glitch. But the unease remained. The clinic didn't feel like a quiet, abandoned place anymore. It felt like something else, something watching. I thought it was just an old building with a weird history. But when the patient file started updating by themselves, I realized something darker was at play. I tried to focus on the task at hand. I needed to make sure everything in the system was running smoothly. But the more I clicked through the patient records, the more I realized something wasn't right. The updates kept coming, faster now, more frequent, more personal. One of the files, a routine update for a patient I'd never seen, described someone in vivid detail: a young woman with brown hair, fatigued eyes, and hands trembling as if under strain. I froze. The description matched me perfectly. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. I scrolled down, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone had updated the wrong file, maybe it was some kind of glitch. But no, the more I read, the more the symptoms didn't make sense. Didn't belong to any patient I knew or any condition I'd seen before. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I rubbed my arms, shivering, though the building's heating system had been working fine all week. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, but this time the hum from the machines grew louder, like it was vibrating through my bones. Every tiny sound, the tapping of the keys, the buzz of the lights, felt amplified in the stillness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a technical issue, a glitch in the system. But the longer I stayed in the clinic, the more something felt wrong. I glanced at the security cameras again, desperate for any sign of life. The footage was grainy, but I could make out vague shapes moving in the halls, shadows that weren't there a moment ago. I zoomed in, but each time I did, the shapes vanished, as if they were never there to begin or with. I started to feel trapped. My heartbeat quickened, my chest tightening with each passing minute. I needed to call someone, anyone, to reassure me that it was just my imagination. I reached for the phone to call the clinic's supervisor, but when I dialed the number, the line was dead. No dial, tone, just silence. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. The clinic was empty. I knew it was empty. But the longer I stayed here, the more the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I couldn't escape it. Then, without warning, the computer screen flashed. One of the files opened by itself without any prompt or input from me. It was a new file, detailing a patient who had just arrived. But the details weren't like anything I had ever seen before. A woman alone in the clinic, surrounded by emptiness, terrified of what is to come. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This wasn't a file update. This was something else. Something that was watching me, tracking me, and preparing for the moment it would consume me. The final line sent a wave of cold terror through me. The next patient is you. I felt it then, in my chest, a slow, crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was overthinking it. But the longer I stayed, the more my skin prickled, with a familiar sense of dread. Something was here, something that had been waiting for me. I looked around the clinic again, my eyes darting between the flickering lights and the long, narrow hallways. The building felt bigger than it should have, like it was stretching, expanding. Could feel the walls closing in on me, the heavy silence pressing down. The file updates were happening faster now, almost like the clinic was feeding on my fear. Each new entry was eerily specific. One described the air stale, cold, suffocating. Another described me sitting in front of the desk, watching the files change. A woman alone in the dark, trapped in her own thoughts, listening for sounds that aren't there. My pulse quickened as I stared at the screen, unable to pull my eyes away. It was like the clinic knew everything about me the way I looked at the door, willing it to open, but knowing it wouldn't. The way my hands trembled as I tried to control my breathing, to force myself to stay calm. I looked down at my hands, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely grip the mouse. Forced myself to move, to check the clinic once more, hoping it was just my imagination running wild. But as I walked down the hallway, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. It was coming from behind the walls. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty hallway. And yet, the sound lingered, scraping louder now, like something or someone was trying to get out. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, and the walls seemed to shift with every step. My heart was hammering in my chest. I was trapped. The worst part? I knew that if I went back to the desk, the next file would be waiting for me. The next file would describe exactly what I was about to do. I couldn't breathe. The clinic had swallowed me whole, and the walls had turned into the teeth of a monster that was closing in on me. I ran back to the desk, desperate for some kind of escape, but the computer screen flickered violently. When it cleared, the next file had updated. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just a record anymore, it was me, described in detail, right down to the exact shape of my panic. The file read a woman trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Every move is recorded, every fear cataloged. I felt my hands begin to shake again, and I knew what was coming. The clinic wasn't just writing about me, it was controlling me. It was using the files to shape my every action. I tried to close the file, to turn off the computer, but the screen refused to blink off. I could hear the sounds again, scraping, whispering, like something was crawling through the walls. Breathing heavily, I looked up at the security cameras, hoping for any sign of life, but the screens were static, each one showing a different version of me standing at the desk, walking down the hallway, looking at the door, desperate to leave but knowing she never could. It was as if the clinic had already written the end of my story. The lights flickered, and in the darkness I saw it. The figure, my reflection, staring back at me. But it wasn't me anymore. The woman in the mirror wore an expression of pure terror, eyes wide and glassy, as if something had taken her. And as I stared, I realized it wasn't just a reflection. It was my fate, frozen, already decided. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was drowning in the clinic's hold, every corner closing in on me, every breath pulling me deeper into its grip. I was part of it now, trapped in its walls, in its files. There was no escape. As I backed away from the mirror, the door behind me creaked open. But it wasn't a relief. No, it was the end. The door opened to a hallway I didn't recognize, stretching out forever, and the air grew thick and cold. I stepped forward, drawn to the darkness, knowing that there was nothing I could do to stop it. The clinic wasn't just a building. It was a living thing. And it was hungry. The walls are closing in on me again. I can feel it. The slow, inevitable pull of the clinic. The air is still, but thick with something cold and suffocating. I don't know how long I've been here. Any more hours? Days? The time has become as warped as the building itself. Every corner feels familiar, but it's wrong. The hallways stretch out like an endless labyrinth, all of them, leading back to the same place, the front desk. The same cold chair, the same flickering light, the same silence. Okay, I try to leave. I open the door to the clinic, but it's always the same. I step out into the empty hallway, only to find myself back in the lobby seconds later, like I've never moved. The clinic has me, and it won't let me go. The files they keep updating. It's not just about me anymore. The system isn't writing my story. I'm writing the next one. The next victim. The clinic is always hungry. It devours everyone who walks through its doors, trapping them in its endless cycle. I can see it in the files, a woman, alone in the clinic, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of her fear growing. She knows she is trapped, but she cannot escape. It's describing the way I feel, the way I'm trapped here, powerless to do anything about it. It's as if the clinic knows every thought I have, every breath I take. My body is here, but my mind feels lost in this place, suffocating in the darkness. I've screamed until my voice has gone hoarse. I've tried to run, tried to break free, but no one hears me. No one sees me. I've tried to call out, but the phone is dead, and the clinic doesn't care. It never has. And then, a door creaks open behind me. I don't need to turn around. I don't need to see who it is. Because I know someone else has entered the clinic. Someone new. The door opens, and the hunger of the clinic shifts focus. Cycle will begin again. The new person will sit where I sat. They'll feel what I felt, the growing dread, the tightening grip of this place. And the clinic? It will never stop. It will always take, always consume. The last time I checked the files, I saw a new entry, a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, waiting for the moment when the clinic will take her too. It's not just me anymore, and neither are you. The door creaks again, and in the distance, I hear a new voice calling my name. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows,